Scout wouldn't stop barking at the water, and Thomas Kane knew from 15 years of partnership that the German Shepherd never barked without reason. The Montana River curved through the valley like a silver ribbon, its waters running clear and cold from mountain snowmelt that had traveled hundreds of miles to reach this quiet bend where Thomas had built his retirement cabin. For 3 peaceful years, this spot had been their sanctuary, a place where an old soldier and his loyal companion could fish in silence and forget about the wars that had taken pieces of their souls. But this morning, Scout's behavior had shattered that peace like gunfire in a cathedral. Thomas set down his coffee and studied the dog's rigid posture, the way Scout's amber eyes fixed on a specific point beneath the water's surface with laser intensity. The German Shepherd's hackles were raised, not in aggression, but in the kind of alert tension that Thomas recognized from their years serving together in places where vigilance meant survival. If you've ever wondered what drives a veteran and his dog to risk everything for truth, you're about to discover that some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some loyalties run deeper than any river. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked, moving to stand beside Scout at the water's edge. "What do you see down there?" The river here was perhaps 8 feet deep, the bottom visible through crystal-clear water that revealed smooth stones, drifting vegetation, and the occasional trout that had learned to avoid Thomas's fishing hooks. But Scout wasn't interested in fish. His attention was focused on something that human eyes couldn't detect. Thomas knelt beside his partner, running weathered hands through the dog's thick coat. At 62, Thomas carried the accumulated weight of too many deployments, too many friends lost, too many operations that existed only in classified files. His graying hair and the network of scars across his arms told stories he'd never share with another living soul, except for Scout. The German Shepherd had been with him through the worst of it, Iraq, Afghanistan, and places that didn't appear on any official map. Scout had saved Thomas's life more times than either of them could count, had been his anchor to sanity when the darkness threatened to consume everything he'd once believed about service and sacrifice. Scout's barking intensified, becoming the sharp, urgent sound that Thomas had learned to interpret as a direct communication. The dog was trying to tell him something specific about what lay beneath the surface, something important enough to break 3 years of comfortable routine. Thomas studied the water more carefully, looking for anything that might trigger Scout's alert behavior. The morning light created patterns on the river bottom, shadows and reflections that shifted with the current's movement. For a moment, he thought he saw something that didn't belong, a straight edge where nature preferred curves, a color that seemed wrong for the riverbed. "Scout," Thomas said quietly, "are you telling me there's something down there that shouldn't be?" The German Shepherd's response was to wade into the shallow water at the river's edge, his powerful body moving with purpose toward the deeper section where his attention was focused. Scout had never been afraid of water, but this wasn't playful behavior. This was a working dog following training that had been drilled into him through years of specialized service. Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with the recognition of impending discovery. Scout's instincts had never been wrong, and if the dog believed something was hidden beneath the water, then Thomas would trust that judgment completely. The current was stronger than it appeared from the bank, and the water was shockingly cold even in the late spring sunshine. Thomas waded out to where Scout was standing, the river bottom firm beneath his boots as he followed the dog's unwavering gaze into the depths. And there, partially buried in river silt and covered by years of accumulated debris, was something that made Thomas's blood run cold with recognition and impossible memory. A military equipment case, waterproof, designed to protect sensitive materials from the harshest environmental conditions. The kind of container that Thomas had seen in classified operations, used to transport documents and equipment that were too sensitive for normal military channels. But this case bore markings that Thomas recognized from a mission that officially had never happened, stenciled numbers that corresponded to an operation he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Thomas's hand shook as he realized what Scout had found. This wasn't just military equipment lost in a training accident or discarded by careless soldiers. This was evidence from Operation Blackwater, a classified mission that had cost good men their lives and left Thomas with nightmares that no amount of Montana silence could quiet. Scout whined softly, pressing against Thomas's leg in a gesture of support and understanding. The dog had carried his own scars from that operation, had witnessed things that no animal should see, had been the only living witness to events that powerful people had worked very hard to bury. Thomas looked from the case to Scout, whose amber eyes held intelligence that bordered on human understanding. The dog had led him to this discovery for a reason, had broken 3 years of peaceful retirement because some truths were too important to leave hidden beneath the water. "Scout," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion he'd thought was long buried. "Did you know this was here? Is that why you brought me to this place?" The German shepherd's response was a gentle nuzzle against Thomas's hand, followed by a purposeful look toward the equipment case that contained secrets from their shared past. Thomas understood. Scout hadn't forgotten Operation Blackwater any more than Thomas had. The dog had been waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, to reveal what he'd somehow known was hidden here all along. With shaking hands, Thomas began the careful work of extracting the case from the river bottom, knowing that whatever it contained would destroy the peaceful life they'd built in Montana. Some secrets, once uncovered, changed everything, and some partnerships carried obligations that transcended retirement, civilian life, and the desperate human need to forget the darkness they'd witnessed together. Scout's barking had been more than an alert. It had been a call to complete a mission that had never really ended. The waterproof case felt heavier than its physical weight suggested, as if 15 years of buried secrets had somehow added their own gravitational pull to the metal container. Thomas carried it to the riverbank, with Scout close beside him, the German shepherd's alert posture suggesting that uncovering the case was only the beginning of whatever they'd stumbled into. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Montana pines, but Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold water still dripping from his clothes. The case bore scratches and dents that spoke of violent events, but the seals appeared intact. Military-grade waterproofing designed to protect contents from environments far more hostile than a mountain river. Thomas's hands trembled as he recognized the specific model, equipment he'd used during classified operations where failure meant more than mission compromise. It meant people died. Scout positioned himself where he could watch both the case and the surrounding forest, his enhanced senses processing information that human perception couldn't access. The dog's behavior suggested they were being observed, that opening the case would trigger consequences neither of them was prepared for. "Easy, boy," Thomas said, but his own instincts were screaming the same warnings. The locking mechanism required a combination that Thomas shouldn't have remembered after 15 years. But trauma had a way of burning certain details into memory with perfect clarity, and the numbers came to his fingers as if he'd entered them yesterday. July 4th, 11, the date of Operation Blackwater, the day that had cost 3 good soldiers their lives and left Thomas questioning everything he'd believed about service and sacrifice. The case opened with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure, revealing contents that made Thomas's chest tighten with recognition and dread. Waterproof documents, digital storage devices, and photographs that captured moments he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. But it was the personal items that hit him like physical blows. Dog tags belonging to Sergeant Maria Santos, the team's medic who had died trying to save civilians in a village that wasn't supposed to exist. A wedding ring that had belonged to Corporal Jake Morrison, who'd never made it home to the wife, who was expecting their first child. And beneath it all, a handwritten note in Scout's original handler's writing. Staff Sergeant David Chun, the man who trained Scout and died in Thomas's arms during the operation's final moments. If someone finds this, Chen's note read, it means Scout, and I didn't make it out alive. The attached evidence proves Operation Blackwater was a setup from the beginning. Our unit was sent to eliminate witnesses to arms dealing between American contractors and hostile governments. We weren't heroes, we were assassins. Thomas's hand shook as he continued reading, Scout pressing closer, as if sensing his emotional turmoil. The village we hit wasn't harboring terrorists. It was sheltering a journalist who had documented the weapons transactions. Our orders came from people who were willing to murder American soldiers to protect their profits. I've hidden this evidence where Scout can find it if I don't survive. He's been trained to recognize the scent signature of this case and lead someone trustworthy to its location. The implications crashed over Thomas like an avalanche. Scout hadn't found the case by accident. He'd been programmed to locate it, to wait until circumstances were right, to choose someone who could be trusted with the truth about Operation Blackwater. David Chun had used his final moments to ensure that Scout would become a living compass, pointing toward justice for the soldiers who had died believing they were serving their country. Thomas looked at Scout with new understanding. You've been carrying this mission for 15 years, haven't you, boy? Waiting for the right person, the right moment. Scout's response was a soft whine that seemed to carry the weight of buried loyalty and inherited purpose. The digital storage devices contained video footage that made Thomas's stomach turn. Conversations between military contractors and Pentagon officials discussing the elimination of witnesses to illegal arms deals. Financial records showing payments to offshore accounts. And most damning of all, the original operation orders that proved American soldiers had been sent to murder civilians to protect a conspiracy. But there was something else in the case that changed everything Thomas thought he knew about that mission. A second note, this one in his own handwriting, dated 3 days after Operation Blackwater. Thomas had no memory of writing it, but the words were undeniably his. Memory modification successful. Subject shows no recollection of actual mission parameters. Recommended for immediate deployment to civilian life with appropriate psychological monitoring. Animal asset to be terminated after debriefing. Thomas felt his world tilt sideways. He'd been subjected to memory modification. His recollections of Operation Blackwater altered to hide the truth about what they'd really been sent to do. And Scout was supposed to have been killed to eliminate the only living witness to the real events. But somehow, Scout had survived. Somehow, the dog had retained memories that Thomas had lost, had been carrying the truth for 15 years, while waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Scout's barking suddenly exploded through the morning stillness, sharp and urgent. The dog was staring at the forest surrounding their position, his body language indicating multiple threats approaching from different directions. Thomas grabbed the case and the evidence it contained, following Scout's lead as they moved toward defensive positions near the cabin. Through the trees, he could see movement, figures in tactical gear advancing with military precision. Scout, Thomas said grimly, I think someone's been waiting for us to find this case. The German shepherd's response was to position himself between Thomas and the approaching threats, his body language radiating the controlled aggression of a working dog preparing for combat. Thomas's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number he didn't recognize. Against every instinct, he answered. Sergeant Kane, a cold voice said, you've found something that doesn't belong to you. Return the case and walk away, and we'll let you live. Thomas looked at Scout, whose amber eyes held intelligence that had been shaped by 15 years of waiting for this moment. I don't think so, Thomas replied. This evidence belongs to the families of the soldiers who died believing they were heroes. Those soldiers were expendable, the voice said, just like you are. The line went dead, and Thomas knew they had minutes at most before the facility was overrun by people who had spent 15 years protecting the truth about Operation Blackwater. Scout's mission was finally entering its active phase, and Thomas was about to learn whether a retired soldier and his genetically enhanced partner could survive long enough to deliver justice for the dead. The river had given up its secrets, but keeping them would require a fight that would determine whether truth or conspiracy would prevail. The first sniper's bullet shattered the cabin window 3 inches from Thomas's head, and Scout's warning bark told him there were at least 6 more shooters positioned in the surrounding forest. Thomas rolled behind his kitchen table, clutching the waterproof case, while Scout took position near the front door with the tactical awareness of a dog who had never forgotten his combat training. The German shepherd's body language indicated he was tracking multiple threats, processing information that Thomas's modified memory couldn't access. "Scout," Thomas called out, "how many are we dealing with?" The dog's response was a series of barks, 4 short, 2 long, that Thomas recognized as tactical communication from their years of partnership. 6 hostiles, coordinated movement, professional equipment. But there was something else in Scout's behavior that suggested the dog knew these weren't random contractors hired to recover stolen evidence. These were the same people who had orchestrated Operation Blackwater, who had subjected Thomas to memory modification, who had tried to eliminate Scout 15 years ago. Thomas's satellite phone rang again, and this time the voice carried a tone of frustrated authority. "Sergeant Kane, you're forcing us to take measures that could have been avoided. The case you've recovered contains classified information that threatens national security." "Whose national security?" Thomas replied, studying the contents of David Chen's evidence cache. "The security of arms dealers who murder American soldiers?" "You don't understand the complexities of modern warfare," the voice said. "Sometimes difficult decisions must be made to protect larger strategic interests." Thomas looked at the photographs of dead soldiers, at the evidence of betrayal that reached into the highest levels of military command. "I understand that good people died because someone wanted to protect their profit margins." Scout's sudden movement toward the back of the cabin warned Thomas that the conversation was a distraction. While he'd been on the phone, the assault team had moved into position for a coordinated attack from multiple directions. "Scout, defensive positions," Thomas commanded, and the German shepherd immediately began coordinating their response with the efficiency of a military working dog who had never really retired. The attack came simultaneously from 3 directions: front door, back window, and the roof access that Thomas had installed for maintenance purposes. But Scout's enhanced senses had detected the movement patterns, allowing them to prepare for threats that normal human perception couldn't anticipate. Thomas's combat reflexes kicked in with muscle memory that 15 years of civilian life hadn't diminished. His rifle spoke with the authority of a soldier who had survived conflicts in places that didn't officially exist. Each shot placed with precision born of necessity and desperation. But it was Scout's performance that made the difference between survival and elimination. The German shepherd moved through the cabin like a force of nature, not just attacking intruders, but coordinating the defense with tactical intelligence that exceeded normal canine capabilities. Scout was reading the assault team's movements, predicting their strategies, responding to threats that hadn't yet materialized. How is he doing that? Thomas wondered aloud as Scout positioned himself to intercept an intruder who was still 30 seconds away from breaching the back window. The answer came from the evidence David Chun had left behind. Additional files on the digital storage devices revealed that Scout had been part of an experimental program designed to enhance military working dogs with cognitive capabilities that bordered on precognition. Scout wasn't just remembering his training. He was accessing enhanced pattern recognition abilities that allowed him to predict human behavior with supernatural accuracy. The battle lasted 12 minutes and ended with 4 attackers down and the remaining 2 in retreat. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. The people behind Operation Blackwater had unlimited resources and would continue sending teams until the evidence was recovered or destroyed. "Scout," Thomas said, examining the tactical situation. We need to get this evidence to someone who can act on it. But first, I need to understand what they did to my memory. The German Shepherd's response was to lead Thomas to a specific section of Chen's files, medical records showing the memory modification procedure that had been performed on Thomas after Operation Blackwater. The process had been experimental, designed to selectively erase traumatic memories while leaving basic personality and skills intact. But the procedure had side effects that the doctors hadn't anticipated, gaps in memory that created cognitive dissonance, phantom emotions attached to events that Thomas couldn't recall. That's why I felt like a stranger in my own life, Thomas realized. They didn't just erase the mission, they erased pieces of who I was. Scout whined softly, pressing against Thomas's leg in a gesture of comfort and understanding. The dog had been carrying not just the truth about Operation Blackwater, but the knowledge of what had been stolen from his partner's mind. But the files contained something even more disturbing, evidence that the memory modification program was still active, being used on soldiers who discovered inconvenient truths about classified operations. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Check your secure email. You have friends who want to help. Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI Internal Affairs. Thomas accessed his encrypted email account and found a message that made his hands shake with hope and determination. Sergeant Kane. The message read, "We've been tracking the individuals responsible for Operation Blackwater for 3 years. Your evidence could provide the breakthrough we need to expose a conspiracy that has murdered dozens of American military personnel. Can you reach the coordinates attached to this message? We can provide protection and ensure the evidence reaches people who will act on it." Scout's reaction to the message was immediate approval, tail wagging, alert but not aggressive posture, the body language of a dog who recognized legitimate authority. Thomas studied the coordinates and realized they were being directed to a location 50 miles away, near Glacier National Park, a place where federal agents could operate with jurisdiction and resources. "Scout," Thomas said, gathering the evidence and preparing for extraction. "It looks like Chen's plan is finally coming together. 15 years late, but maybe that's what it took." The German Shepherd's response was a bark that seemed to carry the weight of inherited mission and satisfied loyalty. They loaded Thomas's truck with the evidence and prepared to leave the cabin that had been their sanctuary for 3 years. Behind them, the peaceful river continued flowing, no longer hiding secrets, but reflecting the morning sun like liquid silver. Scout took position in the passenger seat with the alert confidence of a working dog returning to active duty. His 15-year mission was finally approaching completion, and Thomas was beginning to remember what it felt like to serve a cause larger than personal survival. The truth about Operation Blackwater was about to surface, and with it, justice for soldiers who had died believing they were heroes instead of victims of their own command structure. The rendezvous point was a ranger station deep in Glacier National Park, where Agent Sarah Martinez waited with resources that could finally bring justice to the soldiers who died in Operation Blackwater. Thomas drove through mountain passes that reminded him of terrain he'd navigated in distant wars, but Scout's relaxed posture in the passenger seat suggested they were approaching allies rather than enemies. The German Shepherd's enhanced senses were processing information about their destination, and his body language indicated recognition rather than threat assessment. "You've been here before, haven't you?" Thomas asked, noting Scout's familiarity with the route. Scout's response was a soft whine that carried the weight of memory and inherited knowledge. The dog's connection to this place ran deeper than simple geographical recognition. It was tied to the mission David Chun had programmed into his genetics 15 years ago. The ranger station appeared to be a normal government facility, but Thomas's military experience allowed him to spot the subtle signs of federal law enforcement presence. Surveillance equipment, communication arrays, and defensive positions that suggested this was a temporary command post rather than a routine Park Service operation. Agent Martinez emerged from the building as they approached, and Thomas immediately recognized the bearing of someone who had served in military intelligence before transitioning to federal law enforcement. She was in her 40s, with the kind of alert professionalism that came from years of tracking conspiracies that most people couldn't imagine. "Sergeant Kane," she said, approaching with her credentials visible. "Thank you for trusting us with this. Your evidence could finally close a case that's been consuming FBI resources for 3 years." Scout's reaction to Martinez was immediate and positive, tail wagging, alert but friendly posture, the response of a dog who recognized legitimate authority and benevolent intentions. "Agent Martinez," Thomas replied, "how long have you known about Operation Blackwater?" "Since 2019, when we started investigating a pattern of suspicious deaths among veterans who had served in classified operations. Your teammate Davidson wasn't the only one who tried to expose the conspiracy. He was just the most successful at hiding evidence." Martinez led them into the ranger station, which had been converted into a secure facility for processing classified evidence. Computer terminals, secure communication equipment, and document analysis stations filled what had once been a visitor center. "We've been tracking the people responsible for memory modification programs," Martinez continued. "But we needed proof that the procedures were being used to cover up criminal activity rather than protect legitimate national security interests." Thomas opened the waterproof case and began laying out the evidence that Scout had led him to discover. Photographs, documents, digital storage devices, and personal effects that told the story of American soldiers betrayed by their own command structure. "This is more comprehensive than anything we've recovered," Martinez said, examining David Chen's meticulously organized evidence. "Financial records, operational orders, video documentation. This could support prosecutions that reach into the Pentagon itself." But it was Scout's role in the conspiracy that revealed the true scope of the crimes they were investigating. The Enhanced Military Working Dog Program was designed to create animals with capabilities that exceeded normal canine parameters, Martinez explained, reviewing files that detailed Scout's genetic modifications. But the real purpose was to use the dogs as living evidence storage devices. Thomas looked at Scout with new understanding. They programmed memories into his DNA. Not memories exactly, but behavioral patterns that would trigger under specific circumstances. Scout was designed to locate evidence, identify trustworthy individuals, and coordinate the exposure of classified crimes when the time was right. The implications were staggering. Scout hadn't just been David Chen's partner. He'd been a biological insurance policy, carrying the genetic programming necessary to ensure that the truth about Operation Blackwater would eventually surface. How many other dogs were programmed like this? Thomas asked. Martinez's expression darkened. According to our intelligence, at least 30 military working dogs were modified with similar capabilities. Most of them were eliminated after their handlers died, but a few survived and were placed with veterans who met specific psychological profiles. Thomas felt the pieces clicking into place. "You're saying Scout chose me? That this whole thing was orchestrated?" "David Chun researched dozens of veterans before selecting you as Scout's eventual partner. Your service record, psychological evaluation, and moral character made you the ideal person to carry out the mission if Chin didn't survive." Scout barked once, a sound of confirmation that seemed to acknowledge the complexity of the plan that had brought them together. But Martinez's next revelation changed everything Thomas thought he understood about his own involvement in the conspiracy. "Sergeant Kane, there's something else you need to know about the memory modification you underwent. The procedure wasn't just designed to make you forget Operation Blackwater. It was designed to make you forget that you volunteered for the mission knowing it was morally questionable." Thomas felt his world tilt sideways. "What are you saying?" "You weren't a victim of the conspiracy," Martinez said gently. "You were originally part of it. David Chen's evidence includes recordings of you agreeing to participate in the elimination of witnesses, accepting payment for your involvement, and helping to plan the cover-up. The words hit Thomas like physical blows. Everything he believed about himself, about his service, about his moral character, all of it had been built on manufactured memories, designed to hide the truth about his own culpability. Scout pressed against his leg, sensing his emotional turmoil and offering the same loyalty he'd provided for 15 years. But now that loyalty felt like a rebuke rather than comfort. Why? Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why would Chen save evidence that incriminated me? Because he believed people could change, Martinez replied. The recordings also show you having second thoughts, trying to back out of the mission, and ultimately refusing to follow through with the elimination orders. You were shot by your own team for trying to protect the civilians. Thomas touched the scar on his shoulder that he'd always attributed to enemy fire. They shot me. David Chen's report indicates that you saved the journalist's life by warning him about the attack. Your memory modification was designed to turn you into a hero in your own mind, but the truth is more complicated. Scout's steady presence beside him reminded Thomas that loyalty could exist even in the face of uncomfortable truths. The dog had been programmed to reveal evidence that would implicate Thomas along with the others, but Scout's behavior suggested that forgiveness was possible even for those who had made terrible choices. What happens now? Thomas asked. Martinez smiled with grim satisfaction. Now we use David Chen's evidence to prosecute everyone involved in Operation Blackwater, including the people who ordered the memory modifications. Your cooperation could help us expose a conspiracy that's been operating for over a decade. Thomas looked at Scout, whose amber eyes held the wisdom of an animal who understood that redemption required facing the truth about past mistakes. Agent Martinez, Thomas said, I want to do whatever it takes to ensure justice for the people who died because of Operation Blackwater, even if it means facing consequences for my own involvement. Scout barked once, a sound of approval that suggested the dog's 15-year mission was finally approaching its successful completion. The truth was more complex than Thomas had imagined, but complexity didn't eliminate the possibility of justice. It just made redemption more meaningful when it finally arrived. The federal courthouse in Helena had been transformed into a fortress, where truth and conspiracy would finally face each other in the sterile light of justice. Thomas sat in the witness preparation room, studying testimony notes that contained revelations about his own past that felt like reading someone else's psychiatric evaluation. 3 months had passed since Scout led him to the evidence in the river, and each new detail uncovered by FBI investigators painted a picture of moral complexity that challenged everything he believed about heroism and redemption. Scout lay beside his chair, the German shepherd's presence offering the same steady loyalty that had sustained Thomas through the darkest revelations about his involvement in Operation Blackwater. The dog's enhanced genetics had led them to this moment of reckoning, but Scout's unconditional acceptance suggested that past mistakes didn't have to define future choices. The defense attorneys are going to try to discredit your testimony, Agent Martinez warned, reviewing the prosecution strategy one final time. They'll argue that your memory modifications make you an unreliable witness, that you can't distinguish between real recollections and implanted memories. Thomas nodded, understanding the legal challenges they faced. How do you prosecute a conspiracy when the primary witness had been subjected to experimental procedures designed to alter his perception of reality? But we have David Chen's recordings, Martinez continued, and those show your voice, your face, your decisions in real time. Whatever they did to your memory afterward, the evidence speaks for itself. Thomas had listened to those recordings dozens of times, watching a younger version of himself make choices that led to the deaths of innocent people. The memory modifications had been designed to replace guilt with manufactured heroism, But knowing the truth about his past created a different kind of burden. Scout's sudden alertness drew Thomas's attention to movement outside the courthouse. Through the window, he could see protesters carrying signs demanding justice for murdered soldiers, families of Operation Blackwater victims who had waited 15 years for answers about their loved ones' deaths. "They have a right to hate me," Thomas said quietly. "They have a right to know the truth," Martinez replied. "Your testimony is going to help convict the people who ordered those murders, who subjected you to memory modification, who turned American soldiers into weapons against their own people." The courthouse security was unprecedented. Federal marshals, FBI agents, and military police working together to protect witnesses whose testimony would expose corruption reaching into the Pentagon itself. But Thomas knew that the most dangerous threats weren't the ones that could be stopped by armed guards. The conspiracy behind Operation Blackwater had survived for 15 years by adapting, evolving, finding new ways to protect itself when old methods failed. The people responsible for those crimes wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses who threatened their freedom. Scout's behavior throughout the morning had reflected the tension building toward this moment. The dog's enhanced senses were processing information about threats, opportunities, and the emotional weight of finally completing the mission David Chun had programmed into his genetics. "Thomas," Martinez said, checking her watch. "It's time." The courtroom was packed with journalists, family members, military officials, and federal investigators who had spent years tracking the conspiracy. Thomas walked to the witness stand with Scout beside him, the German shepherd's presence authorized by special court order recognizing his unique role in uncovering the evidence. The prosecuting attorney was a federal prosecutor named James Sullivan, whose reputation for handling military corruption cases had made him the natural choice for a case of this magnitude. "Sergeant Kane," Sullivan began, "please tell the court how you became involved in Operation Blackwater." Thomas looked at the defendants, 7 military officers and 3 defense contractors whose decisions had cost so many lives. Men he'd once respected, orders he'd once followed without question, authority he'd once believed was inherently righteous. "I was recruited for Operation Blackwater in March 2009, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the testimony. "I was told we were eliminating terrorist sympathizers who were providing intelligence to hostile governments." "And did you believe that was true?" Thomas glanced at Scout, whose amber eyes held the wisdom of an animal who understood that truth was more important than comfort. "At first, yes. But as the mission developed, I began to have doubts about the intelligence we were receiving and the methods we were ordered to use." Sullivan guided Thomas through testimony that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Military officers working with defense contractors to eliminate witnesses to illegal arms deals, using classified operations as cover for murder, subjecting soldiers to memory modification when they discovered inconvenient truths. But it was the defense attorney's cross-examination that tested Thomas's commitment to complete honesty. "Sergeant Kane," the defense attorney said, "isn't it true that you accepted payment for participating in Operation Blackwater?" "Yes," Thomas replied, feeling the weight of admission. "And isn't it true that you initially agreed to eliminate civilian witnesses to protect classified operations?" Thomas looked at the families of Operation Blackwater victims, seeing pain and betrayal in their eyes. "Yes, I made choices that I deeply regret." "So why should this court believe your testimony when you admit to being a willing participant in the crimes you are now condemning?" Scout chose that moment to stand up beside the witness chair, his body language radiating the protective loyalty that had sustained Thomas through 15 years of manufactured memories and genuine guilt. "Because," Thomas said, looking at his partner, 15 years ago, I chose to try to stop what I'd helped start. I warned the civilians we were sent to eliminate. I refused to follow through with the mission, and I was shot by my own team for trying to protect innocent people." He gestured toward Scout, And this dog has spent 15 years carrying evidence that would incriminate me along with everyone else, because his handler believed that truth was more important than protecting any individual, including me. The courtroom was silent as Thomas continued his testimony, describing how David Chun had programmed Scout to reveal evidence regardless of who it implicated, how the dog's genetic loyalty had led them to a reckoning that could have destroyed Thomas as easily as it exposed the conspiracy. "Sergeant Kane," Sullivan asked during redirect examination, "what do you hope to accomplish by testifying here today?" Thomas looked at Scout, whose steady presence had guided him through the darkest revelations about his own past. "I want the families of the people who died in Operation Blackwater to know that their loved ones didn't die because of intelligence failures or combat accidents. They died because of criminal decisions made by people who were supposed to protect them." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I want other soldiers to know that if they're ever ordered to do something that violates their conscience, they have the right and the obligation to refuse, regardless of who gives the order." Scout barked once, a sound that seemed to carry the approval of every soldier who had ever struggled with the difference between following orders and following their conscience. The trial would continue for weeks, but Thomas's testimony had provided the foundation for prosecutions that would reshape military accountability standards. As they left the courthouse, Thomas knelt beside Scout and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Your mission's complete, boy," he said. "David Chun would be proud." Scout's response was a gentle nuzzle that suggested their partnership was about more than completing missions. It was about the loyalty that could exist between souls who had seen the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light. The verdict came down on a gray October morning when the Montana mountains were dusted with the first snow of winter, and Scout's behavior suggested that their 15-year mission was finally approaching its true conclusion. Thomas sat in his truck outside the Helena courthouse, listening to radio reports of the convictions that would reshape military accountability for generations. 7 military officers found guilty of conspiracy, murder, and treason. 3 defense contractors facing life sentences for their role in Operation Blackwater. A conspiracy that had operated for over a decade, finally brought to justice. But Scout's restless behavior suggested that legal victories weren't the end of the story. The German shepherd paced in the passenger seat with the focused energy Thomas recognized from their combat days. Alert, purposeful, tracking something that human senses couldn't detect. After 15 years of carrying David Chen's mission, Scout should have been relaxed, satisfied with the completion of his programmed purpose. Instead, he seemed to be preparing for one final phase of an operation that Thomas didn't fully understand. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked, studying Scout's body language. "The bad guys are in prison. The evidence has been revealed. What else is there?" Scout's response was to stare intently at the courthouse steps, where Agent Martinez was emerging with a file folder that made Thomas's chest tighten with recognition and dread. Martinez approached the truck with the grim expression of someone delivering news that would change everything again. "Thomas," she said, "we found something else in David Chen's files. Something he programmed Scout to reveal only after the convictions were secured." She handed him the file, and Thomas felt his hand shake as he recognized the implications of what Scout had been carrying for 15 years. Additional evidence, names of conspirators who hadn't been prosecuted, operations that were still active, a shadow network that had survived the exposure of Operation Blackwater by sacrificing the visible participants while protecting the real architects of the conspiracy. "How many more?" Thomas asked, scanning documents that revealed a scope of corruption he'd never imagined. 43 active military personnel, 16 senators, 8 federal judges, and at least 20 defense contractors. Martinez replied grimly, "The people we just convicted were middle management. The real conspiracy is still operational." Scout barked once, sharp and urgent, his attention focused on something approaching from the direction of the courthouse. Thomas followed the dog's gaze and felt his blood run cold. Black SUVs with government plates, moving with the coordinated precision of a federal task force. But Martinez's expression suggested these weren't FBI reinforcements. They were elimination teams sent to ensure that David Chen's final revelations never reached the public. Martinez, Thomas said urgently, please tell me those are your people. Those are not my people, she replied, already reaching for her sidearm. The conspiracy just activated its contingency plan. Scout's behavior shifted into combat mode, his enhanced genetics processing threat assessments and tactical information that allowed him to predict the approaching team's strategies. The dog had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, the final phase of Chen's plan that would determine whether justice prevailed or the shadow network eliminated the remaining witnesses. Thomas started the truck's engine, while Martinez coordinated with FBI agents inside the courthouse. But Scout's alert posture suggested they had minutes at most before the facility was surrounded by people with unlimited resources and official authorization to eliminate threats to national security. We need to get out of here, Thomas said, but Scout's response was to bark in the direction of the approaching vehicles, not a warning, but a challenge. The German shepherd wasn't planning to run from this final confrontation. He was preparing to complete the mission David Chen had programmed into his genetics, regardless of the personal cost. Martinez's radio crackled with urgent communications from federal agents who were discovering that their secure facility had been compromised from within. The shadow network had infiltrated the FBI investigation, had been monitoring their progress, had been preparing for this moment since the first arrests were made. Thomas, Martinez said urgently, Chen's files contain the locations of evidence caches hidden throughout the country. If we can reach them before the shadow network does, we might be able to expose the entire conspiracy. But Scout's continued alertness suggested that reaching those caches would require surviving the immediate threat posed by the elimination teams now surrounding the courthouse. Thomas looked at his partner, whose amber eyes held the determination of an animal who understood that some missions required ultimate sacrifice. Scout, Thomas said quietly, you've done enough. You've completed Chen's mission. We can run, disappear. Let someone else fight this battle. The German shepherd's response was to move to the truck's door, his body language indicating absolute determination to see the mission through to its conclusion. Scout had spent 15 years carrying the truth about Operation Blackwater, had guided Thomas through revelations that exposed a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government. But the dog's enhanced genetics included programming that went beyond simple evidence recovery. David Chen had designed Scout to ensure that justice was complete, that every conspirator faced consequences, that the shadow network couldn't survive by sacrificing visible participants while protecting hidden architects. Thomas understood. Scout's mission wouldn't be complete until every person responsible for Operation Blackwater faced the same justice that had been delivered to the first group of conspirators. All right, boy, Thomas said, checking his sidearm and preparing for what might be their final battle. Let's finish what Chen started. Scout barked once, a sound of approval and determination that seemed to carry the weight of 15 years of patient loyalty and inherited purpose. The elimination teams were positioning themselves for a coordinated assault on the courthouse, but Scout's enhanced capabilities were providing Thomas and Martinez with tactical advantages that normal military working dogs couldn't offer. As they prepared to break through the encirclement and reach Chen's hidden evidence caches, Thomas realized that Scout's 15-year mission was about more than exposing individual crimes. It was about proving that loyalty, truth, and justice could triumph over any conspiracy, no matter how powerful or well-protected. The final battle for the soul of American military integrity was about to begin, and everything depended on the bond between a soldier seeking redemption and a dog whose genetic programming had made him the perfect guardian of inconvenient truths. Scout's mission was entering its most dangerous phase, but Thomas knew that some fights were worth any risk. Some truths were worth dying for, and some partnerships were strong enough to change the world. The abandoned silver mine in the Bitterroot Mountains had been David Chen's ultimate insurance policy, where the most damning evidence against the shadow network waited in darkness that had protected secrets for 15 years. Thomas and Scout descended into the mine's shaft by rappelling gear, following coordinates that Scout's genetic programming had revealed only after the courthouse confrontation. Agent Martinez coordinated with a handful of FBI agents who had proven their loyalty during the elimination team's assault. But Thomas knew they were operating with resources that paled in comparison to the conspiracy they were fighting. The mine's depths carried the metallic scent of old secrets and the electromagnetic signature of equipment that had been waiting decades for activation. Scout's enhanced senses were processing information about the cache's contents, his body language suggesting that what they would find here would dwarf the evidence that had already exposed 43 conspirators. How much further? Martinez asked, her voice echoing in the narrow tunnel. Scout's response was to increase his pace, leading them toward a section of the mine that had been sealed with military-grade security measures. The dog's genetic memory included access codes and safety protocols that David Chun had embedded in his DNA through processes that pushed the boundaries of biological programming. There, Thomas said, his flashlight illuminating a steel door bearing the same markings they'd found on the riverbank case. Project Nightfall, authorized personnel only. Scout approached the locking mechanism and began a behavior that defied normal canine capabilities. The dog's neural interface was directly accessing the electronic systems, his enhanced genetics allowing him to communicate with technology in ways the human scientists were only beginning to understand. The door opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a chamber that made Thomas's hands shake with recognition and impossible comprehension. This wasn't just an evidence cache. It was a complete intelligence operations center, equipped with quantum computers, satellite communication arrays, and data storage systems that could house the entire digital history of the Shadow Network's activities. My God, Martinez breathed, studying equipment that belonged in the most classified government facilities. Chin didn't just collect evidence. He built a surveillance operation that's been monitoring the conspiracy for 15 years. Scout moved through the chamber with purposeful intelligence, activating systems that began displaying real-time information about Shadow Network operations worldwide. Financial transfers, communication intercepts, operational orders. Everything the conspiracy thought was hidden had been documented and analyzed by Chen's automated systems. But it was the central display that revealed the true scope of what they were fighting. Operation Prometheus. Thomas read from the screen. Global implementation of enhanced soldier programs designed to replace democratic governments with military management councils. The files showed plans that made Operation Blackwater look like a training exercise. Thousands of soldiers worldwide had been subjected to genetic modifications and neural programming, creating armies of enhanced operatives who could be controlled remotely by quantum computing systems. They're not just trying to control the American military, Martinez realized, studying deployment schedules that showed enhanced soldiers being positioned in dozens of countries. They're planning to implement military government on a global scale. Scout's continued interaction with the systems revealed something even more disturbing. The conspiracy wasn't limited to human operatives. Enhanced animals were being used as living weapons, their genetic modifications allowing them to infiltrate civilian populations undetected. Thomas looked at Scout with new understanding. You're not just carrying Chen's mission, are you? You're designed to counter the enhanced animals working for the conspiracy. Scout's response was a bark that seemed to carry complex information about capabilities he'd never needed to use. The dog's genetic programming included defensive measures designed to neutralize other enhanced animals to protect witnesses and evidence from threats that normal security couldn't detect. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The quantum computers began displaying video footage from the courthouse confrontation, showing the elimination team's assault from angles that shouldn't have existed. Chen's surveillance network had been monitoring the Shadow Network's activities in real time, documenting their crimes as they occurred. He's been watching them for 15 years, Thomas said in amazement. Every move they made, every order they gave, every crime they committed, it's all been recorded. Martinez was coordinating with FBI headquarters, transmitting evidence that would support prosecutions reaching into the highest levels of government worldwide. But Scout's behavior suggested that documentation wasn't enough to stop Operation Prometheus. The dog was tracking something approaching the mine, enhanced operatives whose capabilities exceeded normal human parameters, sent to eliminate the final witnesses to the conspiracy. They found us, Thomas said, studying Scout's alert posture. But Scout's response wasn't defensive, it was predatory. The dog had spent 15 years preparing for this confrontation, and his genetic programming included capabilities designed specifically to counter enhanced soldiers. The chamber's defense systems activated automatically, responding to Scout's neural interface commands. Quantum jammers that could disrupt enhanced soldiers, control programming. Electromagnetic fields that interfered with their modified nervous systems, acoustic weapons that exploited vulnerabilities in their enhanced hearing. Chen designed this place as a fortress, Martinez said, watching the defensive measures deploy. He knew the final confrontation would happen here. The assault came from multiple directions simultaneously, enhanced soldiers moving with superhuman coordination and capability. But Scout's genetic programming allowed him to predict their strategies, to counter their enhanced abilities with defensive measures that Chen had spent years developing. The battle that followed was unlike anything Thomas had experienced in 3 decades of military service. Enhanced soldiers whose capabilities exceeded normal human parameters, facing defensive systems designed by a man who had anticipated their every move. But it was Scout's direct confrontation with enhanced animals working for the conspiracy that revealed the true scope of Chen's planning. The German Shepherd's genetics included programming that allowed him to override the control systems of other enhanced animals, to turn the conspiracy's living weapons against their handlers. One by one, the attacking enhanced operatives found themselves facing animals they thought were under their control, creatures whose loyalty had been restored by Scout's intervention. When the battle ended, the enhanced soldiers were either dead or had been freed from their programming by Scout's genetic capabilities. The Shadow Network's final assault had failed, and Chen's evidence was being transmitted to law enforcement agencies worldwide. Thomas knelt beside Scout, whose enhanced genetics had saved democracy, but at a cost that was becoming apparent. The dog's body was shutting down from the strain of using capabilities that pushed beyond safe biological limits. Scout, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. You did it. Chen's mission is complete. The conspiracy is exposed. Scout's amber eyes looked up at Thomas one final time, and in them Thomas saw not just the loyalty of a faithful companion, but the satisfaction of a soldier who had completed the most important mission in military history. The German Shepherd's final breath carried the weight of 15 years of patient preparation and inherited purpose. Scout had saved not just American democracy, but democratic governments worldwide. And Thomas finally understood that some missions transcend individual survival, that some loyalties echo through generations, and that some dogs become legends whose legacy protects freedom long after their bodies return to the earth. 2 years after Scout's sacrifice exposed Operation Prometheus and dismantled the global Shadow Network, Thomas Kane stood beside the Montana River where their impossible journey had begun. The waterproof case was gone, its secrets revealed to the world through congressional hearings that had reshaped military accountability standards across 43 nations. But the river continued flowing with the same clear persistence that had hidden Chen's evidence for 15 years, now reflecting morning sunlight like liquid silver, unmarked by the darkness it had once concealed. Thomas placed a wreath of mountain wildflowers at the spot where Scout had first detected the buried case, flowers that carried the scent of freedom and justice finally served. The German shepherd's sacrifice had prevented a global coup that would have replaced democratic governments with military management councils. But the price of that victory was a loyalty that had burned itself out in service to truth. The last of the enhanced soldiers were rehabilitated yesterday, Agent Martinez reported, approaching across the meadow with steps that carried the satisfaction of justice finally served. Scout's genetic programming continues to protect them through quantum systems worldwide. His consciousness has become a digital guardian that prevents any attempt to reimpose mental control. Thomas nodded, understanding that Scout's legacy lived on in ways that transcended physical existence. The dog's enhanced genetics had evolved into something greater than individual sacrifice, a permanent safeguard against the corruption of military loyalty. How many governments fell because of the evidence? Thomas asked. 17 military coups were prevented, 43 enhanced soldier programs were shut down, and over 200 conspirators are serving life sentences, Martinez replied. Scout's mission saved democratic institutions worldwide. But Thomas's attention was focused on something that defied rational explanation: movement in the forest surrounding the river, the approach of an animal whose bearing reminded him of another German shepherd who had changed the world through loyalty and sacrifice. A young dog emerged from the trees, moving with intelligence that seemed familiar yet unique. The puppy's markings were similar to Scout's, but carried something more, an alertness that suggested genetic memory and inherited purpose. Where did he come from? Martinez asked, watching the puppy approach with confident steps. Thomas knelt as the young dog reached him, looking into amber eyes that held wisdom beyond normal canine intelligence. Around the puppy's neck was a collar bearing a single notation: Scout 2, genetic heir, mission continuing. David Chen's final gift, Thomas realized, understanding that the surveillance operation in the mine had included more than evidence and defensive systems. He preserved Scout's genetic line, ensured that the protective programming would continue through future generations. The puppy, Scout's biological and genetic heir, pressed against Thomas's hand with the same trust that had sustained their partnership through 15 years of carrying buried secrets. But this young dog's mission would be different, focused on prevention rather than exposure, on protecting democratic institutions before they could be corrupted. What will you call him? Martinez asked. Thomas looked at the river that had given up its secrets, at the mountains that had witnessed the triumph of loyalty over conspiracy, at the young dog whose genetics carried the promise of continued protection for those who served with honor. Freedom, Thomas said simply. His name is Freedom. The puppy barked once, a sound that seemed to carry Scout's approval and the promise of missions yet to come. Senator Williams arrived at the memorial site, carrying documents that would establish the David Chen Foundation, an organization dedicated to protecting military personnel from exploitation disguised as service, and ensuring that enhanced soldiers worldwide received proper care and oversight. The Foundation's first initiative will be a global monitoring system, Williams explained, using technology based on Scout's genetic programming to detect and prevent unauthorized enhancement programs. Thomas understood that Scout's sacrifice had created more than justice for past crimes. It had established permanent safeguards against future corruption, systems that would protect soldiers' minds and loyalty from those who would exploit them. As they prepared to leave the memorial site, Freedom led them to something Thomas hadn't noticed before: a small stone cairn built beside the river, marked with a simple inscription: "To those who serve with honor, your loyalty will be protected." The cairn had been built by veterans who had learned about Scout's mission, soldiers who understood that some partnerships transcend individual service, to become guardians of the principles that make service meaningful. Thomas picked up Freedom and carried him toward the truck, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility and the lightness of mission completed. The young dog's presence suggested that Chen's vision would continue, that enhanced genetics would serve protection rather than control, that loyalty would triumph over conspiracy for generations to come. "Ready for your first mission, boy?" Thomas asked as they drove away from the river. Freedom's response was a bark that seemed to carry Scout's voice, a sound of determination, inherited purpose, and love that transcended the modifications that had shaped their existence. Behind them, the Montana River continued its eternal flow, no longer hiding secrets, but reflecting the clear light of truth finally revealed. The water carried no trace of the darkness it had once concealed, only the promise of freedom protected by loyalties that would echo through eternity. Thomas Kane had begun this journey as a retired soldier, seeking peace beside a quiet river. He was ending it as the guardian of a legacy that would protect democracy for generations yet unborn. Scout's mission was complete, but Freedom's was just beginning. And in the quantum systems that monitored enhanced soldiers worldwide, Scout's digital consciousness continued its eternal watch, a ghost in the machine whose loyalty would never fade, whose protection would never fail, whose love would guard the innocent until the end of time. Some partnerships transcend death, some loyalties become legends, and some dogs become angels whose wings are made of honor, whose halos shine with the light of truth, and whose bark echoes through the halls of justice forever. The river had given up its secrets, but it had also given the world something far more precious, the proof that loyalty, courage, and love could triumph over any darkness, no matter how powerful or well-protected. Scout's legacy would flow like that Montana River, clear and strong and eternal, carrying the promise of freedom to every shore it touched.